Welcome to the Startup Grind.
All right, folks. So, super excited to be here. As mentioned, my name is Sedale Turbovsky. I'm the CEO and co-founder of OpenGrants, and we're going to talk a little bit about getting grant funding for startups specifically, but yeah, we'll also talk about just grants, like high level what they are and what they're not. Did a little background on myself before this. This is my fourth venture-backed company. Before that, I managed about a $5 billion portfolio of grant-funded projects, about $1 billion, which was grant funding. There's a lot of other blended capital. So myself and my team, we had a 99.9% success rate securing funding, which sounds impressive, but it actually isn't. Really what that is a really good ability to identify projects that are going to be successful. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that all works and what that looks like. But one of the things that's really exciting, grant funding, is non-dilutive capital, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of funding out there. And what we always encourage startups to think about, and founders in particular to think about, is how to leverage your capital stack really efficiently and effectively. Because at the end of the day, when you get that big old exit, if that's what you're building towards, you want to come away with a lot of ownership, right? And so there's venture money, which is really expensive, but obviously sometimes very necessary, especially if you're trying to scale that billions kind of exit. There's debt, there's all kinds of revenue-based financing you can do, and there's grants. So in the spectrum of capital and cost, grants are the cheapest kind of money you're going to find, right? They are non-dilutive, they don't require any repayment. So that's super cool because, it's basically money that has, the only cost to it is the opportunity cost, right? You got to go out and get it. And that can be quite confusing for anybody because the system around grants is not really built in a super user-friendly way. So I'm going to just dive in a little bit to talk about, grants are capital, but they're also they're not just capital. There are some very important things that come with grant funding. And grant funding is unique because it's designed to create impacts in the world instead of commercial returns, right? So the risk profile for grants, like, if you've ever tried to go get a loan or, looked at like debt, there's some risk assessment that goes into like, hey, are you going to repay this? And that's often tied to like your credit score or other things like that, your business track record, revenue. Grant funding, you don't have to have any of that. You could have defaulted on, you could have a credit score of 1, and people would still give you a grant if they thought that was going to create the impact they wanted to see in the world. So grant money is like, it's got the highest risk profile, and that's really exciting for entrepreneurs because the other thing that you'll probably come across if you happen to be raising capital from venture capitalists is they'll say, all right, well, what's the risk to my investment here, right? And venture capital is pretty high risk, right? They'll bet on you super early. They'll give you capital up front when you just have an idea. And they'll give you a ton of money with no expectation of repayment because most of their investments go up in smoke. So they're expecting it to go to zero. And grant money is even more aggressive, right? So grant money de-risks all kinds of innovation before it ever gets to venture. And in fact, like 2/3 of the really cool tech that we use right now, the internet, cell phones, GPS, all that came out of grant funding from the federal government in the United States, in fact. So grant funding is like a really positive signal for investors. It's a really cool way to say, all right, well, we got our first sale because it is ultimately results in you signing a contract, getting money to go do something. It is, of course, non-dilutive capital, but it's also, and I think one of the most exciting things about it, apart from the money aspect, is it's a relationship. So all of a sudden, you have a financial relationship with someone like the Ford Foundation or Schmidt Futures or the National Science Foundation. These are not inconsequential organizations, right? They've got a lot of clout. They hold a lot of respect in the eyes of industry, investors, and other folks. It can be a great entree to a ton of customers. My first company, Carbon Blue, which we did manage to exit, we got a grant for $500,000 from the state of California to go out and do customer discovery effectively. So ahead of rolling out our product, we met with our customers for over a year. We had this great big old chunk of runway that allowed us to go and build a book of business that ended up being millions and millions of dollars in contracts. And that was all funded by the federal government because what they wanted to know was, hey, what are your customers up to? We happened to be serving a customer group that was of specific interest to the state of California. And so we got paid by the state, and they didn't want anything back except for a report about what all these people said when you interviewed them. So it was an incredible opportunity, and that brings me back to kind of like the thing I want to drive home, which is you want to be tactical with your capital as a founder, and you don't, it's not like hammer, meat, nail. It's, hey, some things are really good to do with revenue-based financing. Like if you have a sort of like direct-to-consumer brand, and you know that when you put this much money in, you get this many inbound on your website, which convert at this rate, revenue-based financing is incredible for that because you know what the calculation is. And you're like, all right, well, if I want to grow to 60K a month, I need to pull a lever over here that allows me to put this much money into ads, right? Super easy calculation to do. It can be very tactical. You don't need to take venture money and give away a bunch of your company to make that happen. You can go to a revenue-based financing provider. Similarly, if you're a startup and you're looking to do something really innovative, or maybe you're looking to create some social good in the world, or maybe you are supporting economic development or some of the other aims of grant funding, you can use that to like tactically approach whatever that thing is. And we do see grant funding kind of falls into two key buckets or three key buckets. One is kind of deep tech and sort of primary research. So if you're working on some kind of technology, right, that is pretty cutting edge, that's a great thing to use grant funding for. Then there's social good things. So take the log RX, like there's tons of money from justice, OES, and a lot of other spaces within the kind of criminal justice and social services that fund these kinds of activities and these kinds of tools. And so you can use grants as not only a way to do research and develop your product, but specifically for something like this, you could use grants as like a sales enablement tool, right? So you come to a group, they're like, hey, this is super cool, but we can't afford it. And you can say, look, here's a grant for it. You just got to fill out the paperwork. So grants can be super useful in that way. And then finally, the other place that we see grant funding a lot is in sort of like what we broadly define as economic development. So if you happen to be doing something in infrastructure or housing, what have you, community development, tons of money for that, especially from the federal government. And so those are kind of the spaces we see grant funding available. Lots of places to find grants. I always say like, there's all these aggregators and tools, including OpenGrants, which is our company. There's ways for you to dive in and start getting an idea. But, the best place to start, frankly, is talking with people who know the space, right? So other founders in your space who might be building companies similar to yours who've like got farther down the path, they might know of programs that they use. Technical, like subject matter experts also probably have a good idea of the funding that's available. And the reason I bring that up is like the first thing you should do is because oftentimes I find people who wander in and are saying like, oh, I want grant funding for my business and I'm a minority or whatever. And that's not a good ask because there's not grant funding for that. What there is grant funding for is like, oh, I'm doing a business. I happen to be a minority business owner. And that like aspect of the fact that you're doing something can give you like extra points or better standing with the funders, but that's not what like the funders are funding, right? The funders are trying to create some kind of impact in the world. They want to make things more energy efficient or they want to put charging infrastructure in. And if you happen to be a founder who is a minority, and you're putting charging infrastructure, and that's really cool. That's an added advantage that when you go up for that money, they're going to give you an extra consideration. But it doesn't work the other way around. So important to understand, like, the one we get frequently, like, hey, are there grants for veterans? Like, no, not specifically. There's grants for veteran business owners who happen to be doing something, but there's not just like grants for veterans. That isn't exactly how this works. What the government is trying to do is they're saying, hey, look, these different groups and protected classes we're trying to make the playing field equitable and we're trying to open up opportunities, but they want to open up those opportunities within specific spaces. And so you want to understand how to frame your question so that you get the right responses back, right? And there are platforms that help with that. I've listed a variety of tools here. Some are paid, some are not, that you can use to find grants. But the upshot of all of that is to say that if you're looking for grant funding, the first thing you might want to do is talk to somebody who is in your space. Talk to some experts. You can Google, you can go to any of these spaces. But it's good to get an idea of how to frame the question the right way. And talking to someone can really help you do that because they've maybe encountered that already. So the other aspect, first you found the grant, how do you successfully win grant funding? And this is kind of at the crux of all of the interesting stuff that we do. The first part about being successful with securing grant funding is just about following the rules. So oftentimes grants will be put out there and there'll be, generally speaking, there's some rules. Sometimes it's really easy, like fill out this form. But for big grants, in particular, like government grants, where you're looking at, 100K or 250K or $1 million or $90 million, there'll be a PDF of some kind that'll be issued as like a GFA or a NOFA, or they have a bunch of different terms for it, but basically it's saying, hey, we want you to submit a grant. And they publish this thing. And this thing is a solicitation for proposals. And there's rules in there. And they can be as detailed as like, you need to submit this grant in like Times New Roman. So like they can be as detailed as down to the font type and like gutter size on the pages. They'll have specific word like requirements sometimes in terms of word count. Like they can be very specific. And the point of this is to say that many times people will say, or they'll publish some information or some clause. It's like, oh, we reserve the right, even if you don't follow the rules, to like accept your proposal, which is not really the case. Like you have to understand that these folks are sifting through usually way more proposals than they'd like to. And they use the rules as a way to like dump a bunch of stuff right out the gate. So they're not even going to read your proposal if you don't follow the rules. And the other aspect of following the rules, though, that I also think is funny is like, this is that axe, that initial like gate that they're going to judge your proposal by. And if it doesn't get through, you're going to have spent all your time putting together a proposal that no one reads. So follow the rules. That's the first one. Read the request for applications closely, do what it says, follow the rules. If you do follow the rules, the other aspect of that, though, is that you're just on the same footing as everyone else who followed the rules, right? So if everyone follows the rules, we all are following the rules. So that doesn't really get you that competitive edge that you need to be successful. And the other thing that like this is really where applications and applicants shine and like pull away from the pack is in being a good partner. And so we break it down this way. In terms of being a good partner, there's basically four main parts. One of them is following the rules, of course. That just demonstrates that, hey, you're listening and you're engaged and you're there to do what you need to do. But grant funding as like a first principles basis is really an exercise in communication. You are trying to communicate to somebody else who cares very deeply about something, that you're the best person that they should give money to go do that thing in the world, right? So on their side of the table, they're saying, hey, we want to put money out in the world to change X. And you're coming to them and saying, yeah, we're the perfect people to do that because X, Y, and Z things. And so if you're doing your research, you'll start to understand like there's a lot of nuances to many of these programs, and there's a lot of different things you need to unpack about funders in general. And some of the things that you're going to learn is that, yeah, maybe like broadly they care about, opioid addiction, or maybe broadly they care about, energy efficiency, but specifically because they're a gas company, they care about a very specific thing about energy efficiency, and they want to prove that certain technologies work and certain don't. And so understanding those incentives and helping doing the research up front allows you to communicate really effectively to them. So that's the first part. It's like doing that research. Part of that research also involves just showing up and being involved ahead of the grant. So one thing we see that I just tell people is sort of a waste of time is we'll see people just see a grant opportunity and then respond to it, which on the face of it sounds like an okay thing to do, but actually it's a really dumb thing to do. And that kind of goes back to the incentives, right? Like over here, these people, once again, they don't really care about your credit score or anything like that, but they don't want to look dumb. And if they don't know you, and there's a bunch of other people who they do know, they're going to give the grants to those people. And this isn't like collusion or buddy-buddy things. This is just oh, this company has been showing up month after month with nice little reports. They've come to our meetings. They're involved in the community. We know what this company is doing. And if you're over here, company X that they've never heard of, and their choice is between company, involved over here that's part of the community or what have you, and company X that they've never heard of, they're going to pick this one. That's just how this works. And so, you want to get involved on the government side with federal and state and, city funding. There's really easy, very clear ways to get involved, right? There's public advisors, there's public meetings, there's usually a time for public comment. on any given sort of like grant funding initiative that they're working on, get involved. Like get involved with all that stuff. Make sure your name's there. Make sure you're submitting intelligent comments. Make sure you're part of that process so that they know who you are. On the foundation side, it can be a lot harder because foundations aren't under any of the like public requirements. They're not spending tax money, so it's just it's much harder to network into those spaces. But once again, the networking is very key, and you want to be aware of that. And then there's foundations that do invite-only grant making. In fact, a lot of foundations only do invite-only grant making, which once again, if they don't know you, then obviously you're not getting invited. When you talk about doing the research, a lot of that does involve networking, developing relationships, being involved, following the rules, obviously. Another aspect, though, to ensure your successful communication, and once again, it is just all about communication, is a lot of the folks who are in these spaces in terms of grant making are not necessarily technical experts. Like if you're building something, you're probably a technical expert, but the people who are reading your applications are probably not. And in very few instances they are, and I would say it's really reserved for the SBIR programs, so the Small Business Innovation Research Grants. Otherwise, these folks don't know what's going on. And so if you use a bunch of like industry jargon and a lot of confusing technical language, they're not going to get it. So you want to make it super digestible in terms of the actual content that you submit. Make sure you're using clear, concise language. Obviously, don't do anything like fraudulent or misrepresent yourself either. It goes without saying, but really clear, concise language that people can digest and understand. And then finally, this being a partner thing, it's at in number 4 here, but it's really also part of number 1. And this circles back to what I was saying earlier is, post awards, you certainly want to recognize your funders, right? Like you don't want to just like send out a press release, we built this thing, and then you forgot to mention that, somebody gave you $1 million to build the thing. Obviously don't do that. So be a good partner. You're going to get more out of it than they will, right? Like they're already usually like huge if they're giving grants, and unless they've specifically told you not to mention them, it's probably a big part of why they want to be mentioned, give the grant away is to be mentioned. So make sure you're recognizing them. You can also get a lot of like, say you've partnered with the National Science Foundation, your whatever presence in the world is probably pretty small compared to the National Science Foundation. So if you can partner with them on a press release about what you've done with your company, it's good for you. You're going to be getting a lot more out of it than they will. So definitely lean into that, leverage them as a partner. It can also lead to more grant funding down the road, of course. So you want to develop that relationship and really think of them that way. As a partner and as an asset for you and your company. And then on the foundation side, same thing goes, generally speaking, they're going to be bigger than you and have more clout. So being a partner from the beginning to the end, making sure you're executing on everything, doing the reporting, making sure you're following the rules, because past the submission, there's other rules. They may say, hey, we want a monthly report, or we want an annual or quarterly reports. Make sure you're doing all that stuff. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions. But, high level, this is kind of core to, if you're a startup looking for grants, this is the process that we've seen be super effective for companies raising money. And grant money, like I said, really is a good tactical tool, and is certainly not, I don't think, at least in my opinion, a great tool for everything. But it is a great tactical, way to address certain things within your organization.
So in terms of doing the research, I think I actually looked at OpenGrants and then did a search for what we were doing, and I didn't find anything. So I'm sort of thinking maybe I should have expanded my search, or what do you think?
Also, maybe talk to somebody. Often, 9 times out of 10, people are searching for the wrong things. Like they think they're using the right words, but they're not. And it's not any fault of any normal human beings. It's just that like the words that people use out there in grant making land are not normal words. One of the cool projects, we helped somebody get a grant from the Digital Humanities Office, which, that's just an unintuitive term, right? Like who is going to use digital humanities? But it happens to be kind of in like the documentary and like multimedia space, right? But who'd use the word digital humanities? So one thing we find all the time is people just don't know how to search, and that's part of why we built like OpenGrants itself is sort of using AI and ML to match people to grants so you don't have to search. But that's one thing we see all the time, and that's also why I brought up talk to somebody who has done it before, because they will frequently have a better idea of what those terms are.
Janine, you had a question? Do you want to unmute and ask your question? Let me see if I can find her.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Thanks for letting
ahead,
me
Janine.
ask you this. Like you had just said, there's this process that one goes through with which to help themselves into the ocean. Seems of wayward of grants that one can avail or have the access to avail themselves of. Would you recommend, probably like yourself, work with a developer so that you can link arms with he or she to help yourself have less of the possible frustration by with which to cruise through finding grants or winning grants? I hope you understand my question.
I think I got the gist of it.
Okay.
I highly suggest working with an expert. You're 3 times more likely to be successful if you work with a consultant. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of grant programs that I know of that are like truly like easy to apply for. So yeah, I mean, anytime you can get a professional to help you out, that's, I think, a win in my book. I tend to make the analogy of attorneys, right? Like anyone could go and read the law and figure it out, right? Like that's something you could do. But we hire attorneys because they know specifically like how it's supposed to be interpreted, and also they've already done all that work. So, it's either you spending all that time getting up to speed, maybe not being very good, or finding a professional who's already up to speed and ready to rock and roll. And there's nuances, and I do think like the aspect of like the interpretation is really important. There's nuances to any program out there. And so, for example, what we do at OpenGrants that really optimizes for success is we don't just connect people looking for grants to any like grant writer. We connect people who are looking for NSF, SBIR grants to people who write NSF, SBIR grants because they know that program. It's a lot like, I think, taking the analogy a bit further. It's like you don't want a tax attorney doing family law. You want, a tax attorney doing tax law. And I find that in this space, the consultants are very similar in terms of their specialization tends to be important and relevant to the outcomes of your project.
And just the audience, I killed our video here because it seemed like we're having bandwidth issues. So hopefully you could still hear us, and we can be able to hear you guys. Go ahead, John.
Thank you.
Sedale, I think you said something very important, and sometimes I think it's overlooked. A little bit.
You're welcome.
A little while ago, you mentioned the idea of developing the relationship with the grantor. Over time, literally, you find it once you get your subject matter identified and you know what channels you're going to be going through for the types of grants you're going to be pursuing. Relationships on the other end are very important because the residual from that is the next round, and not just tiered grants that you prove concept, you're getting more and more, but related grants, just knowing the community and them knowing you and having those personal relationships. It's a little inside baseball. It's not inappropriate at all because it doesn't give an advantage as a personal thing, more as a reputational thing in an industry. I think that's very important, maybe sometimes overlooked how important that is. And grants are not just a one-off for a startup. Once the startup gets it, there are continuing relationships for larger grants, more specialized grants, things like that. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I think that's the real texture of pursuing grants, not a one-off, I feel.
Yeah, it does depend on the funder, but in particular, federal funding does tend to act that way. and foundations to some extent. But yeah, to your point, there's, for example, the SBIR program, right, is a very there's not only this direct pipeline of SBIR phase 1, where you're doing more prototype and conceptual stuff, to phase 2, to phase 3, but a lot of agencies and other groups within that space use grant funding as a means to either test out prior to running your procurement process or to sidestep the procurement process altogether. And so if you've developed a good relationship, for example, the DoD is a very popular pipeline for this kind of thing, where you might go down the SBIR route, and then all of a sudden you may have these specialized grant opportunities that pop up for you that the agencies themselves have put them together on your behalf, because they want your technology, they want what you're doing in their space. And so, yeah, to your point, there's a lot of opportunity to grow within an ecosystem for funding as a founder. And it does have to do a lot, and that's kind of key to being that partner also is, if you're being collaborative, even if you stumble along the way, not through any sort of fraud or things like that, but if you've stumbled because some technical issue has occurred, or you've fallen short at reaching your deliverables, if you work collaboratively and just demonstrate that you're a good partner and that you act with integrity, they're going to want to keep working with you. And they're going to want to keep giving you money, which is, exciting. So yeah, it's a great way to go. And certainly there's a lot of, and this goes back to the incentives, because I will caveat this with that there are some programs that are specifically built to move you from grant funding into contracting, which is kind of a better position, I think, for companies, because then you have these deeply sticky recurring contracts. And so you do want to understand what the point of the funding is, because the vehicle itself and sort of the outcomes you're creating are deeply relevant to the next thing. And so, for example, SBIR, the whole point is if you've done well with phase 1, and phase 2 is the point. And then if you've done well with phase 2, phase 3 is the point. And if you've done well with phase 3, then commercialization and a contract is the point. And along the way, there might be some side quests to go on. But yeah, it's a very cool dynamic. And a lot of it also comes down to, again, understanding incentives, right? So for the DoD, for example, it's super hard for them to buy stuff. Their procurement process can be a year. It's really lengthy and cumbersome and awful. And it's hard for them to also get contracts and contracting with smaller companies for a variety of reasons. They'd rather give it to Raytheon or someone like that. So grants are often a vehicle, in some situations, it's important to understand, the reason they're giving you this grant because they want to see research, or is it because they're avoiding a procurement process, or are they preempting a procurement process? And what things should you do through this grant that helps them get to their goals, and be aligned when those things are happening, because it can be a big deal for you.
So is it, is it possible, with the federal government, for example, it sounds like we kind of need to understand beyond what's, what their goals are. And I'm guessing maybe that's not always stated on the grant request. So is there a way to get to know that person behind the curtain?
Well, it's some of it's knowing the people, of course, for their clear incentives, right? Are they trying to do something for their boss, or where are they trying to go in their career? But it is important to understand in the request for proposals, there's often some language, but you want to get to know the agency, figure out what they do and why they exist and what their general plans and meta goals are, because you want to understand, for example, understanding California's climate goals and emissions reduction goals at large as a meta concept is deeply important to, if you're going to go to the California Energy Commission, which is just one agency out of a whole state that is highly bureaucratic, the 5th largest economy in the world. So this is a massive government that you're trying to understand, but understanding their meta goals of oh, the state put out these goals of emissions reduction by 2030 and getting all diesel vehicles off the road. And if you happen to just be going to the California Energy Commission, it's really important to understand the context of okay, they're under these pressures and directives and they have these larger goals, and this little program guy who's giving out $10 million for EV charging, he's got some things to think about, plus he's got these other things to think about, plus his boss is thinking about these other things. And so understanding that whole collection of incentives that are driving that activity is really important so you can speak to it. And so a lot of it is reading, if you want to do it yourself, or talking to a consultant who has already read it all. There's a lot of reading to be done, I think. And then meeting with people, of course, is also important. But
So when you're looking at a grant, like do you let's just say that there's probably some there's probably some point of contact, right? Do you then reach out through the formal channels, or do you go to like LinkedIn and see if you can reach out, email them directly or communicate with them directly?
well, it depends on who it is. If it's the government, then the formal channels are honestly best because there's a process and they have to be responsive. Right? Like they're required to do X, Y, and Z things if you send an email. And then if it's a foundation, I mean, just find a way to get introed. Foundations are more like hunting investors, I've found. It's just like network and network.
Okay.
But the government, there's like laws. They're civil servants. They have to respond eventually. Like you just got to go through the right process and know how to follow that down the pipe.
Okay.
So, Sedale, where do we find these grant consultants? Are they all industry specific, or are there people out there that you'd recommend, or companies we can go to? We have a startup idea and we're trying to find grant
Yeah.
clients?
I mean, OpenGrants is a whole marketplace of these folks. So if you go into OpenGrants, it's free. You can type in NSF SBIR and you'll find people who do that. You can type in FEMA BRIC, you'll find people who do that. But like I said, there's also, in your own network, right? If you find other founders who work in your space, they might know somebody. I would talk to them. And then other than that, there's places like Upwork, there's Google. I think personally, like with anything, if you're looking for a specialist, it's important to know what you want them to specialize in and like what your requirements are out of that person. And so, I think it's helpful to just have a clear definition of like what you're looking for too.
I have a question from Anne Marie. Anne Marie, do you want to go ahead and unmute and talk and ask your question?
Sure. I wanted to go back a little bit to, and this follows through, I think, on what you were just talking about, but when you said get involved with federal, state, and city funding by, I have a AR, VR educational and wellness game company, startup, and I just did a workshop at the public library for kids to learn how to make VR games. But I want to do more workshops like that. And I'm wondering if, because it really helps me with my development process to get feedback from the users. And I just wonder how I can, maybe get small grants from local government agencies like that.
Yeah, I mean, so the getting involved process is pretty straightforward from a high level, but it does require either some like real beating of the bushes, or once again, sometimes it's easier to talk to a consultant to get you there. But every like public entity that makes decisions and deploys capital, et cetera, they have public meetings, they post it somewhere. They have requirements to make all this information publicly available. Sometimes it's kind of like hard to find. But it's there. And so, that like high level, if the public library is a great example. That might be a little bit more difficult to navigate, frankly. But like if you know that your, city council is working on something, you could go to their meetings. You can meet with them individually. You can talk to them and see what's going on. If you have for example, if you're thinking about like maybe you fall into like the workforce development space. There's public meetings. They solicit so in California is the California Workforce Development Board. Other states, probably similar names. You can go connect with that agency and get plugged in to their public events and meetings and things that they've got going on. The answer is not like standard, unfortunately, because every agency has their nuances and every place has its own quirks. But generally speaking, in particular for the government, all these processes are open to the public. You're working with your civil servants, and that's right in the title. They're here for you. So as a constituent, you have access to meetings. You have rights in terms of like getting responses back and information back. You have even more rights. You know, you got to go deep and like file some FOIA requests. Like that can take ages, by the way. But you know, like you have a lot of rights and tools as a citizen and as a constituent. The other thing that actually, something that's actually kind of helpful and useful is if you have like you know who your representative is. Their office can sometimes be super helpful. We've used that as a vehicle a few times to get letters of support for different grant proposals, where we'll reach out and say, hey, you know, Senator Feinstein's office, like, can you get us X, Y, and Z things? We're a business in your district and we're looking for, you know, X. They can actually be really helpful. And sometimes they're like under a little bit less pressure from like bureaucrats. And so they might be a little more responsive. And then they can like kind of get you the ends that you need with wherever you're trying to go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So how much, if we wanted to hire a grant consultant, how much are we looking, you know, how much should we budget for?
I think, you know, as startups, a good process is to invest first in an actual strategy. So instead of like saying, hey, I want you to write this SBIR grant for me, say, hey, I want you to map out what grants I should be applying for over the next year. What does that look like? And based on these kind of capital requirements. So you're looking at spending anywhere from $3 to, you know, $5K on a consultant to put something together for you like that. And most good consultants, they'll be anywhere from like 100 to 250 an hour. Really good consultants might be like 380 an hour. They can be quite expensive depending on how technical you are and how technical they need to be. So if you're hiring a PhD and you're doing something in like you know, quantum computing space, you might be spending a lot of money on a good person to like get the job done.
Any more questions? Okay, any maybe final words that
Yeah, I mean, so my takeaway that I try to get everyone to like come away with from these is twofold. One is, you know, grant funding is really great for very specific things. It is not like good like general use capital. And in my opinion, the grants that are like for general use are way too small to like be worth the effort, right? So there's grants out there that are like 5 or 10K and it's just like, it's really not worth it. Like you could spend the same level of effort and go after 100K, so you might as well do that. And the other thing, so there's that, right? Like grants are good for very specific things. So we'll start to think specifically about the things you're trying to do within your business, right? Because they're probably not going to like give you a grant to just, you know, develop software or, you know, build your app. But if you like, you know, have a very specific use case in mind or a really specific thing you want to accomplish, like that's, you know, that's where you can start to differentiate and it'll help you with your search. And that's the other thing I want to say is don't like, if you just go out and you're like, I want grants for my business, you're never going to find grants for your business or you're going to find a bunch of garbage products. But if you go out and you say, look, I want grants to like do last mile delivery between this train station and this neighborhood that I'm working in, that you can find grants. You know, there's all kinds of people who have a lot of money and they're trying to deploy it. Everyone from HUD and the federal government on down, it's a conversation we have every day, is, hey, there's billions of dollars and we can't get it out the door fast enough. And I do want to stress that, like, there are plenty of people, including the federal government, who are trying to deploy money, and they can't for the life of them find enough people who are ready to take it. So there's this huge, like kind of tension happening at the moment where it's just like, oh, there's all this money, it's on the sidelines. There's more money in private family offices than there are in all the hedge funds in the world right now. There's a ton of capital on the sidelines just waiting to be activated and deployed. So get a clear ask, figure out what you want to do, and then go start asking people. And that's my final takeaway, is just ask for money. I think a lot of founders are really bad at that, frankly. And if anyone knows me, I love asking. I ask for money all the time. I'm just like, give me money. I could use money. You could use money. Go ask for it. So that's the other part, is like make the asks. The more that you like practice making the asks and work on the asks, it's just like raising capital, like venture money, I should say. Ask people. There's also like, once again, it's like those foundations that you don't know about, this family office that you don't know about. Like one of my first investors when I was raising our kind of pre-seed round for OpenGrants was this woman who had a family office. I had no idea that she had a family office or that she was really wealthy, but she was. And we were just talking one day. I was like, hey, you want to invest in OpenGrants? And she's like, yeah, here's a check for 100K. I was like, okay. And, you know, come to find out that she has this whole like, you know, investing thing that she does that I had no idea about. So there's all kinds of money out there. People are very interested in supporting your idea. So get really clear about what your ask is and then start asking.
Yeah, I got that. Is it okay for me to, they're asking for your contact information. Is it okay if I paste your email?
Probably just hit me up on LinkedIn is best.
Okay.
My inbox is a bit messy.
Yeah, I know.
So don't email me. LinkedIn or Twitter is great. And then I can send people like a meeting link or something. But if you go in my inbox, it may be several weeks before you hear back from me.
Yeah, I'll post your LinkedIn link in there.
That's perfect.
Okay, I guess as it's pulling up, because we're really having crappy internet here, I'm just gonna close out and share my screen.
All right.
Can you copy of the slides?
Yeah, I'll send those over to Rich and he can email them out.
Yeah, I'm just trying, here it is. So that concludes our session today, but I just want to recap what we're going to be doing. If I can find it, too many things open. Oh, here it is. So next week on March 1st, we're going to have our Founders Anonymous here at Granite City. That is in person only. And the following week we have Beer and Geeks. It'll be at Escape Folsom, and that's just casual networking. And I always think it's pretty cool when, you know, people that have their skill sets meet and magic happens. March 15th, we're having a lunch and learn and developing an online course. And then just keep checking our Eventbrite. If you search Startup Folsom, or you can look at Startup Grind, you'll see all our events coming. So with that, thanks everybody. And if you want to stay on, I will go ahead and post Sedale's contact LinkedIn information.